and let's test it. I don't have speakers on this, so you won't hear it.
Oh. I guess I'll have to switch.
No, you won't. You could use that.
Okay.
You could use that and then you hand it off to me.
Yeah.
Does
So,
that work? Or just put it in your ears. You don't have to put it around your neck if you don't want.
okay. I'm just trying to figure out how
How they go.
Yeah.
Can you hear it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Say something.
Yes.
Heard it?
Yeah.
We're in the. What do we want in the background?
Okay, just leave it as that. That's fine. Okay. And but we're gonna stop the recording. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Friday, the fourth day of 4 powerful days with 4 incredible business mentors. And today, our guest speaker is Olga Nikolaya, and she is an end-of-life nurse educator, a dying well advocate, cannabis educator, and end-of-life doula mentor with over 25 years of professional experience as a registered nurse in various healthcare settings, including hospice, palliative care. And Olga has been involved in the national, provincial, and local community efforts to shift the way we view and approach our dying experience, death, and grief, including how we care for each other at the end of life. Now, since 2017, she has facilitated an online Centology courses through Centennial College. And forgive me, Olga, for stumbling. And in 2018, she started facilitating the end-of-life doula course through the Douglas College across Canada. And also, she is also the founder and director of the dyingmatters.ca, a death awareness educational social enterprise, and is the founder and director of the Death Doula Ontario Network, which she founded in June of 2020. Now, Olga also serves as an advisor on a number of international, national, and local committees and boards. And over the past 5 years, Olga has been honored to share her end-of-life knowledge with over 700 participants/students, and most proud of creating a safe space for personal stories, exploring our struggles with grief and end-of-life care. That's a long bio, but that's okay. Gives you a good outline of who Olga is. And today she's going to talk to us about business and grief. Okay, and it's going to be an interesting topic, and I'm certainly looking forward. And I'm going to say welcome, Olga, and I'm going to turn the floor over to her.
There we go. Hello, Evelina. How are you this morning?
Good morning. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. All right. I'm going to put up my slides so you can see. All right, here we go. Just going to adjust. I'm going to share my screen. Here we are. You can see my screen okay? Perfect. Just going to make sure if we have any additional participants, I will let them in and we'll get started. All right, so welcome. This portion of our 4-day business growth event is really focusing on grief, especially in relationship to supporting employees, or also supporting yourself as you're navigating through business and being aware of some of the particulars of what people may experience as they're going through their own grief journey. So why is this an important issue? Well, here's the thing. One of the things that we know is that grief impacts people on many, many different levels. And I'm going to speak to the different aspects that actually are affected by grief. And that also has a huge impact on, people's abilities to be able to continue to work and their ability to continue to concentrate and not make mistakes. And as you can see there, you see that a lot of people actually oftentimes will leave their job or will need to take some time off. And so that's going to have a huge impact on their particular progress or their particular business. You also see there that there's a sort of a double-edged sword, that many people are also caregiving. And so there might be caregiving for maybe their senior parent, or maybe the sandwich generation, oftentimes folks who, especially women who are caring not only for their children, but also for their aging parents or maybe even neighbors, and are still tasked at needing to support themselves and have financial success. And so therefore they're trying to juggle all of these different stressors in their life. And you see here as well that we've had a number of losses across Canada with people are trying to find a balance between caregiving and the role within the workplace. So I'm going to speak a bit about the history of grief, sort of a little bit about how did we get here and why are we having some of these struggles, especially in the workplace. Also looking at the impact of grief on the workplace. So what's happening with the person? How are they impacted by grief within the different aspects of themselves, emotional, physical, mental, and even spiritual. And then I'll offer up a few support suggestions and maybe some resources as well, so that you may have maybe some place to go or engage some of the leaders that are actually supporting workplaces in order to be able to provide support for employees or even provide some grief education. So here's a bit of our history of grief in the workplace. So you can imagine that over 200 years of industrialization has really focused us very much on really focusing on work, and that Protestant work ethic where we're working so much we're actually sometimes don't even take the time to kind of refresh or be able to take care of ourselves. The other impact over the years is that we've also lost some of our family connections. I think probably in the last 50 years, with a lot of moves of people needing to move to secure work, maybe in the cities, they're leaving their kinship or larger sort of communities or their family connections. And therefore, they actually don't have necessarily a lot of informal kind of support, right? And if you can think about, maybe yourself, if you are of that sandwich generation where you're taking care of your children and you're taking care of your elderly parents, oftentimes you bear the burden of caring without a lot of maybe additional family support. And so I think that is why we also have a lot of support services that are in the communities. The other is that we've kind of lost a little bit of that work-life balance. We're always striving to be able to continue our businesses, continue to work really hard. And at the same time, maybe just the 2 weeks vacation isn't enough to recoup some of that energy that we may have lost, especially if we're both working and caring for people who need some care. The other is that toxic positivity. So this is something fairly new that has probably maybe a term that you're not very familiar with, and is really speaking to the fact that oftentimes in our societies, we may actually really focus on sort of moving people out of pain or out of difficult situations as a way of sort of providing some sense of maybe positivity, but at the same time, there's a huge risk of really moving people too quickly into more of the positive aspect of life. And sometimes people feel like their pain or their particular suffering isn't really acknowledged, or there is no safe place in which they can talk about some of the difficulties that they're having. And so all of that combination of the sort of the impacts and all of the different variables have therefore resulted in possible costs within the workplace environment. So there might be a reduction of productivity from the employee or even employer as well, right? We can't forget that they themselves may be going through a grieving process. There's also a higher risk for errors, as people oftentimes have difficulty in concentrating when they're working through or dealing and coping with oftentimes an emotional kind of time for themselves. And therefore, it might slip into actually creating an environment that may not be really safe, not only for them, but for others in their work environment. The other cost is really the personal cost to the person, especially if they're not able to be supported in the workplace. They may feel very isolated, very alone. They may have more incidences of depression. And I want to just state that, grief doesn't necessarily lead to depression or clinical depression, but certainly can impact already someone's maybe mental health balance. So let's say for those people who may already have some mental health issues, maybe related to depression or anxiety, it might actually compound it if they're going through a grieving process. And when we're not supported, when we feel that we can't speak about some of our painful experiences or find a place, maybe in, and here we're talking about workplaces, if we're not able to find a place in our workplace where we can kind of explore some of the difficulty, then we might actually have more and more complications related to our grieving process. And so all of those things have a huge impact on the well-being of employees and the workplace environment, really. So I just want you to, for a moment, just to reflect a little bit on your own grief experience. And I just want to say that, grief isn't only about the loss of a person. Grief is something that we experience when we're experiencing a loss of maybe even a sense of self, or even a loss related to, a relationship or a move, any kind of really big changes. Right? Oftentimes we'll have a loss component as we adjust in some way to the new reality. So when I think about in our recent past, not so past yet, as we're going still through the pandemic, that itself is actually a loss. And people may not even acknowledge that they're actually going through a grieving experience, not being able to engage in some of the activities that they were used to pre-pandemic. Also the stressors of some of those limitations of what they can and cannot do. So all of those losses will result in a person actually experiencing grief. So when you reflect on your own life, you may, if for just for a moment, if you think about maybe a loss that you've had, just to reflect on what that felt like for you, were you able to kind of engage in the everyday process? How were you impacted by your own grieving experience in your workplace? And what you may find is that the impact of grief, as I said at the start of this webinar, is that it impacts us in our emotional, physical, mental, and even our spiritual aspects. That oftentimes it is about a sense of loss that we feel. So emotionally, we feel a lot of different emotions, not only sadness, we might have anger, we might have guilt, blame, shame. Oftentimes our emotional well-being is also something that we learned from our family. So sometimes the influence of the past will also guide us on how we deal with grief and how we cope. And as you see there, also the past experience with grief. So if you maybe were raised in a family or a community where grief isn't acknowledged, then again, you might establish more of a sort of a stoic kind of an approach, or you may actually not even acknowledge the grieving process. And so therefore it kind of still sits in your emotional in your emotional sense, and you may not be able to find ways to deal with some of your own feelings as you're going through this process. The physical aspect is oftentimes something that people don't always talk about and don't necessarily recognize, but grief is actually something that we feel physically. Yes, we experience all of those emotions, but it's something that we, is felt in the body. that when you are under stress, there's actually physiological things that happen. Actually, parts of the brain are impaired a little bit. Your heart rate will go up. Sometimes you may also find that if you have any aches and pains, they become a little bit worse. So everything gets a little bit more compounded. People may also experience fatigue. They may also experience insomnia. So all kinds of physical type of symptoms that they might experience, right? And there's a reason for that. I think that when we go through a loss experience and as we're grieving, which is our personal way that we integrate this particular loss, is sometimes it demands that we take the time to actually sit with the particular grief that we're feeling. And so it's like the body is telling us, okay, you need to sit with this, be able to acknowledge that this change has happened, and how to move through integrating it into your life experience. And so part of that is how to attain some of that resiliency from our emotional well-being. Maybe it's about also how we can acknowledge some of those physical impacts and then be able to take care of ourselves so that we can, get enough sleep, get enough rest, get enough good food and nourishment, even hydrating. Oftentimes people may experience sort of not caring for their physical when they're going through a grieving process. So it's one of the things that I work with clients on, is how they can really pay attention to their physical needs and be able to, take care of themselves. Then we also have the impact of our mental aspect. So again, if you go back to your own personal experience, you might find that you may have been overwhelmed with thoughts or been overwhelmed with the tasks of things that had to get done. And so, if we're not able to sort of think straight, and again, sometimes the impact of the grieving process and the stress of it will impact certain parts of the brain, especially the frontal part of the brain, which is really in charge of making some of those executive decisions. And so there's oftentimes a lot of uncertainty and a lot of overwhelm and a hard time concentrating, right? Because you may find that sort of the thought process, the recapitulation of the experience that you're grieving from may actually be the thing that is on your mind. And so it's really hard to shift that focus. And so there's also ways of helping folks to kind of get distracted, but also recognizing that they might only be able to sort of pay attention or focus on small tasks, or maybe be able to only pay attention for a period of time without needing to take a bit of a break. So that way we can start thinking about these different aspects and different ways that we can provide support so that people can better cope with their grief experience. And as you see there, the spiritual aspect as well. A lot of people oftentimes will say that they've lost some sense of hope, that life may not be worth living, that they're sort of contemplating some of their existential reality. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And sort of questioning their life experience until they can come to some terms, or as we say, come to some level of accepting the reality that has happened. So you see there how all of those aspects are really impacted by the grieving process, and they kind of work together, right? Oftentimes people who may feel very emotionally overwhelmed, oftentimes can't focus their mind. They may also feel more aches and pains, and therefore have a sense of sort of loss of hope in their spiritual aspects. So you can see how they're very interconnected and interdependent. Now let's take a journey through grief. So this is a little wheel that I like to share as a way of, how do we engage with the grieving process? So when we experience a loss, oftentimes the first thing that we may experience is shock, sort of this, oh, how did this happen? Which may put us into the feeling of numbness, denial, which actually is a defense mechanism. So it's not that, denial is a refusal of being able to be in the grief experience. It's actually sort of like a pause, that we need to sometimes not think about, our particular grief experience or the loss that we've experienced, because it helps us to continue to do the things that we may need to do. Prolonged denial, or the prolonging in this shock phase, sometimes is going to have real detrimental impact on physical aspect, on the mental aspect. So again, oftentimes in the conversation about what has happened and in speaking about or sharing our particular experiences gets us out of the denial, and so that we can actually be more in the experience and know that we can be supported. Then from shock, we might go into protest. You know, if we go back to, maybe you're familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages. Denial was kind of the first part, and then the second part may have been anger or yearning or searching. So this is part of the sort of the protest, sort of some of the conversations that we may have in relationship to, I can't believe this is happening. How did this happen? Maybe it's not true. You know, the way that we naturally kind of go into thinking about these things in this way. I would also say that depending on the type of loss that somebody has experienced, and if we focus on maybe a human loss, right? So somebody in your family who has died, the protest or the sort of the shock of it is also dependent not only on your own experience with the grieving process, but also it's influenced and impacted by the type of death that you may have bear witness to, or the type of death that you're actually grieving. So that sudden or unexpected deaths may be more intense. It's not to say that expected deaths wouldn't be, because there's still a shock component, but certainly those ones are really impactful and will in some way put a person into the place of sort of not being able to come to terms with what has happened. And then after some of the anger and yearning and searching, there might be a lot of confusion and withdrawal, as sort of the person may feel that their life or their circumstances right now are really sort of turbulent. They're not sure where they're going to go, where they're going to turn. Sometimes there's a lot of overwhelmed. They may actually withdraw sometimes, so they might isolate themselves because they're not sure how others will sort of respond to their disorientation or their disorganization. And that may also spill out into the workplace, right? As people are not able to necessarily really focus, right? Sometimes that there is restlessness. There might also be, as you see here, apathy. So kind of a numbing and not being able to relate to others because they're going through their own time of feeling that depression or feeling the confusion. And then, as you see here, then there might be some moving again through that cycle to reorganize. So as they gain some more support from maybe their friends, their family, as they regain some sense of emotional stability, as they're able to maybe put some things in place to create some order in their life, there will be a process of reorganizing where they might be able to see some meaning in what has happened and be able to come to terms with that. And as you see there, that if they're able to move through that, then they can step into recovery. They can step into, being able to kind of find some healing in their process. And if they're not, then it might loop them back into the cycle again. So there might be some deterioration of the process where again, they'll slip into another shock and protest and disorganization with again, another attempt for them to find some healing through this particular process. And Arlene, if you have any questions and you want to put your hand up or write anything in the comments, I'm more than happy to answer any questions. The other thing I just want to say about this particular wheel is that, one of the things in the grief research is or sort of in the public sphere is that grief is something, especially after a loss of a person, is that they would kind of finish things off in about a year, that there's this sort of cycle of grief. Thanks, Arlene. I like the wheel too. But one of the things that we know from some of the research is that the real work of grief, like really integrating the loss, doesn't usually happen until the second year. Most people find that in the first year, they kind of numb through the process of the first, birthdays or the first holidays or those kinds of things. And it's usually in the second year that people are really impacted by the reality of the loss, right? And unfortunately, oftentimes grief support is offered for a year, and there aren't always, support services that sort of are ongoing for people. So sometimes people have a difficulty finding someone, a counselor or someone that can really support them through the grieving process that they may still be working through in the second or third or fourth year. And I would say that I think that, the thought of getting over your grief, I think is actually a false statement. I think that it's learning how to adjust, learning how to integrate the particular loss into your life experience, that there really isn't ever a getting over, that it's how you can come to terms with, but it isn't an, over and you leave it behind, that it becomes part of your life experience. And so you might also find that, for you or for some of your employees, they might sort of circle back into this cycle, and especially maybe in anticipating of the death anniversary, or maybe the person's birthday, or maybe something, like a holiday, that it might actually start back up again. And might be quicker, it might not be as impactful, but certainly you might sort of, rework the particular grieving process. So let me talk specifically about some of the aspects and what you might see in the workplace, and the things that we might be able to do to support people as they're grieving. So as I spoke to, the emotional aspect, people oftentimes will feel overwhelmed, lots of different feelings. They may also feel like they can't control their emotions. And so sometimes that is, especially for people who might have sort of a fragile characteristic, meaning that they may not have a lot of emotional intelligence, that they maybe aren't even aware that some of their particular behavior is really linked to their maybe feelings that they're having about this particular experience. Sometimes people may be really short, or maybe kind of abrupt. And it's partly because they're feeling insecure, they're feeling vulnerable. And so it's, again, a defense mechanism that oftentimes comes up. So the impact on workplace might be that folks might seem really withdrawn, that they're not sharing a lot, that maybe they're not even engaging in some of the, teamwork, those kinds of things. And that they also might feel like they're not able to make decisions because there's a lot of uncertainty that they're feeling. And so I would say that, it's how you can, within your own workplace, provide some of that reassurance for people. Maybe it is about acknowledging the fact that they're going through the grieving process and that they don't necessarily have to make decisions at that time, or being able to provide for them, some support of having conversations and helping them to make some decisions that they have to make. So it's really, how can we support people so that they can not feel so overwhelmed and know that they're being supported. Then we have the physical impact. So as I talked about this already a little bit, people may feel very fatigued. So that's going to actually impact workplace, and, presenteeism, where somebody might be at work, but may actually not be present, right? So they're preoccupied in their thought process, or they actually physically are not able to really engage in some of the work, or they may not actually even be able to go to work because they're are suffering with an insomnia, or they might actually even get ill. There are lots of people who will actually get quite sick when they're going through a grief process, and so they're not able to be very productive, and hence therefore would have low productivity, because they need to in some way sort of recoup, right? They need to be able to kind of regenerate some energy for themselves, because the grieving process takes a lot of energy, and they can't always control it. Then we have the mental aspect. So again, I talked a little bit about this already as well, where folks may not be able to focus. They may not be able to concentrate. And again, if you think about your own grief experience, I know for me, when I experienced the loss of a sudden death, I actually couldn't even, stop my brain from thinking about why did this happen? How could this have happened? It's like I didn't have any kind of control. And for me, it was the experience of in that first week after the death. So this is another insight, is that oftentimes the acute grief process can be really overwhelming, right? Where there is no way that you can control it. Sometimes you can distract yourself with something so you're not thinking about it, but it's like the brain is trying to really make sense of what happened and you don't necessarily have a lot of control. So think about the fact that for some people, this is, during their acute grief process. So the first week after a death or in the first couple of weeks, and then how we can actually be able to adjust maybe to alleviate some of the pressure of the mental capacity for people when they're going through the grief process. I know that, some people may have some time off within their workplaces, 1 to 3 days maybe, but oftentimes they may need that time to actually have all of their affairs in order or assist in the process of completing some of those affairs. Maybe they also spend a lot of time, being able to coordinate funeral services, those kinds of things. And those things are also very, very taxing. So again, consider someone's going through their grief process, they're not able to concentrate, and now they not only have to still go to work and do some of their work responsibilities, but now they have additional responsibilities that they need to take care of. And that can be really, really overwhelming. So the impact on the workplace might be that they may make more errors, right? As they're not able to be really clear. It may even create an unsafe work environment, not only for themselves, but maybe for others. So we need to be really conscious and aware that that could be a possibility, and then maybe provide a safe space or, for the person to do some other form of work, especially if they might be doing work that could put somebody else at risk. And then the spiritual aspect, again, as I mentioned, could lead people to a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, like they're not sure where they're going to go on. And that has a huge impact on their motivation, even their satisfaction related to work-life balance, or even related to their work, because they're really struggling to find some sense of how to move forward and what's going to be the thing that's going to help them to kind of gain more energy or finding some of that hope. Because again, I think if you reflect back on your own grieving process, it can be really difficult when you're experiencing a loss to be hopeful, to look forward to certain things, because you feel that profound sadness and that profound grief. So here are a couple of suggestions for how to provide support for those who are grieving. One thing is potentially to provide some bereavement support, so maybe some time off. But I would say, you might want to have a conversation with the person. Would you like some time off? Would that be helpful for you? Can we create some, flexibility in the work-life balance? And I think there's more opportunities, especially now with post-pandemic, in relationship to creating sort of a hybrid work model where some people are able to do some work from home without going into the workplace, but again, not feasible for every single kind of job or every single workplace. The other might be that, again, having that conversation with the person as a way of what their particular needs are, because sometimes, as I said, people may need the distraction of work to not think about what is happening in their particular life as it relates to the losses. And so they might need the time of really concentrating on some tasks, and that might give them some reprieve from their grieving process. The other is that I think we, as a business owner, it might be good to provide some education around grief. And it could be something like this as a way of sharing with people, having a death educator or a grief counselor or someone who can come in and let people know about what they may experience, right? Because oftentimes, unless you're someone like me who's interested in the study of thanatology and in the study of end-of-life care and in the study of grief, most people aren't necessarily interested in it, and then don't know necessarily where to turn or the resources to find when they're going through their grieving experience. The other is that maybe there's an opportunity in the workplace to create a safe space. So maybe there's another cubby or a boardroom or some kind of a relieving place, maybe someplace where there might be some flowers or some plants or some space where the person themselves could go to as a way of finding, 15 minutes of meditation or relaxation, or just be able to go somewhere, but be able to go somewhere where they could maybe move through their emotions, those kinds of things. I think sometimes people get overwhelmed with their emotions, and they don't always necessarily feel like they could express their emotions. And so sometimes they need a safe space to do that. And as I mentioned before, to find that balance, really work with a person to say, what are your particular needs? What can I provide as maybe the employer, so that we can come to a balance where you can still be able to do the work that needs to be done and acknowledge that you're going through the grieving process, right? So maybe it is about some time off, maybe it is about a hybrid model, maybe it's about also creating that safe space, but really working with them to create that flexibility. And then the other is more on a national level is Pallium Canada, which is a national organization providing education around palliative care, is now in the process of really supporting communities and building compassionate communities. So building communities in which people can support each other as they're helping their community members go through end-of-life care support as well as grief support. And they're actually, I'm just going to put that in here. They actually just came up with a new program, which is compassionate workplace environments. So really working with businesses, working with community businesses and Chamber of Commerce to provide a workplace that really builds that compassionate communities, acknowledging their grieving process and how they can support people who are experiencing grief. I've also put in here, so this is more so specific to the region here in Hastings County, so around Madoc, so Heart of Hastings Hospice is an organization, hospice organization, and there are many hospice organizations across Ontario, across Canada, who also provide grief support. They might have a grief group. They may also have some grief resources, like a grief library, so that people can, if they don't know where to go or what to look for, they can actually go or call the hospice and say, do you have any kind of reading material in relationship to grief? Because I think, again, educating ourselves on the process is a really good thing, so that we don't feel like, what's happening with us, and acknowledging the fact that many of us have very similar experiences in our grieving process. So they have a lot of information and also have support groups. Now, a lot of the hospice grief support groups have also gone online. So they pivoted their particular services, which were in person, and were able to offer up online support for people. I also included Bereaved Families of Ontario, so another organization. They have a number of different chapters across Ontario, again, supporting families in their grieving process. Sometimes they even have very specific grief support for very specific types of deaths, because sometimes people really need to affiliate with other folks who have similar grieving experiences. And then there's also the Bereavement Ontario Network, which is a network of grief support services, grief counselors. So another great resource that you can provide to your employees so that they may be able to find somebody who can help them through their grieving process. And there's a little bit, if you want more information, there's my particular website. And we rambled through this. So Arlene, I just want to ask if you have any questions, if there's anything that you want to ask about the presentation or.
No, I thought it was awesome.
Okay, great. Are you?
I really enjoyed it.
Great. Are you a business owner? Do you have employees?
Yeah, my husband owns a business and I work with him. So yeah, we work together. We have 3 employees.
Okay.
So we're just a small,
Mhm.
but I mean, it also goes outside of the workplace too, trying to understand what people, I love that grief wheel.
Mhm.
Yeah, loved it.
Right, because it encompasses all those things, and it again, right? I think it's not the stages, because I think there's a huge myth, and when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross sort of devised the stages of grief, she didn't really mean them to be that you go through this process and then you jump onto the next. What she was trying to reveal is these were the things, these were the 5 things that she actually saw and that people talked about who were grieving, and they were far more on a wheel, kind of a format, because they were oftentimes interconnected, right? It's not like you go through a denial and you're done with it and you move to anger. It's the recognition that in a split second you can have all of them playing out, right? And that the aim isn't to necessarily get someone to acceptance, but how to enable them to better understand their particular grieving process.
Like when you showed the wheel, it made me realize that my friends that grieve for a really long time, it's like I thought it took so long to get to one stage. I didn't realize that you go through all the stages and start over again.
Yeah.
And once I saw that, it was like, oh crap, that's what they're doing. Right, because you can see it. So yeah.
And it is that cyclical pattern, right? So maybe it's, initially in that first week, in the first month, in the first year, there might be really, really intense as they move through that wheel. And then the next year and the year after and following, it might decrease some of the intensity, but they still might go through that particular process.
One of the people at my work lost both parents in a short period of time. And I can see that in her too. But we were her, when you said in your talk that people go to work because that's their comfort place.
Right.
That's what she did. She came to our work because it was her comfort place.
And she didn't want to think about, right? I mean, again,
right.
It's to find that balance. For some people, they need to engage in their work as a way of distracting themselves, removing themselves from some of the emotional intensity of their grief. And so they may not necessarily experience the errors because they're able to kind of set that aside, but to know that it can also spill out in such a way so that people are impacted by their grief, and then it spills out into the particular work that they do. Yeah. So
I thought this was excellent.
Great. Great. I'm glad.
Yeah, no, it opened up my world of the grief process.
Good.
So yeah, no, that was excellent. I'm glad I was on back-to-back webinars this morning, so I was late getting in on yours, but I'm glad I did. Yeah, it was good.
Great. I'm glad I could provide a little bit of insight. Okay, I'm going to hand off to Sherry to close us off. Just give me 1 second.
Okay, thanks.
Want me to move out of the way so you can get in? Today, there you go. The book.
Hi, Arlene. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a long time.
I sent
since
you an
we-
email to give me the link and then,
Well, I've been having some
What's
technical. I said I was having some technical difficulties with my computer, so I had to join with Olga and share her space today. So,
oh, yeah.
yeah. So,
But
oh,
yeah, no, this was good. I'm glad you had it.
well, I do this every quarter, Arlene. It's something that I do enjoy doing.
Oh, do you?
Finding the guest speakers is really fun too, because you search, I got so many contacts all over Canada and the US, and you get all these people together, and like yesterday we had a large crowd, and Monday we had a fair amount of crowd too. So it all depends on who comes on. We had over 30 people register, and so it's sad to see today that only
Yeah,
two people showed up today, but it's maybe not a topic for everybody, and that's just the way it goes, but it's okay. It's all good. So, but
I
anyway,
thought it was excellent.
yeah.
Yeah, this is the one that I really wanted,
Oh, there you go.
this one here. So,
Good.
yeah, yeah,
Well, I'm
yeah.
just gonna wrap this up for a minute, then I
no,
can
that was
stop.
good.
Yeah, so just give me 1 second. So I'm just gonna say to everyone, thank you for coming today.
Okay.
For 4 powerful days with 4 incredible business mentors. I really appreciate everyone joining us this week, and we'll see you again in October.